Imagine, there is a fire burning in front of you. Inside it lies a useless, lifeless piece of metal. A man picks it up and throws it into the fire. A few moments later, he pulls it back out, red hot, glowing as if the fire itself has transformed it. Then he strikes it, once, twice, and again. With every blow, the metal bends, stretches, and slowly begins to take shape. He doesn't know it yet, but he isn't just hammering a piece of metal. He is about to put one of the most dangerous weapons the world has ever known into human hands. Something that would give a person the ability to strike farther, faster, and with greater force than ever before. But the real question is this: what was going through that first person's mind when he looked at a piece of metal hidden inside the fire and thought, could I turn this into a sword? Because the moment he had that thought, world changed forever. Now think about the weapons humans already had. They had spears and axes, weapons that could deliver powerful blows, and in the case of spears, keep an enemy at a distance. So why did they need to invent an entirely new weapon, the sword? Take the halberd. It was essentially a blade mounted at a right angle on the end of a shaft, and it was an incredibly versatile weapon, but that was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Tried to do everything, and when a weapon is designed to perform multiple jobs, it can become a compromise. Instead of being truly specialized for one technique, every strike has to balance different purposes. That is why, toward the end of the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, weapon technology gradually began to specialize. Instead of relying on one all-purpose weapon, warriors increasingly moved toward dedicated tools. One was the sword, designed primarily for slashing and cutting at close range. The other was the spear, optimized for thrusting and striking from a distance. And archaeological evidence supports this shift, where analysis of ancient Bronze Age weapons has revealed different patterns of damage on swords and spears. Their edges and tips show damage consistent with different kinds of impact and use. That suggests something important. Ancient warriors were not simply using different weapons because they looked different. They were increasingly choosing different weapons for different kinds of fighting. The age of the all-purpose weapon was slowly giving way to something more specialized, and that specialization would eventually turn the sword from just another weapon into something entirely different. The first swords they cast were beautiful, perfectly symmetrical, some were even decorated with silver inlays. But many of these swords may not have been capable of surviving a real fight. So what went wrong? Beginning, weapons were made from pure copper. Simple mace heads, dagger blades, and flat axe heads were either hammered into shape or cast in basic open molds made from stone or clay. The biggest problem was the copper itself. When long, flat weapons were cast from unalloyed copper, defects could form inside the metal, lumps, voids, and other imperfections that weakened the blade. And even if the casting was successful, there was an even bigger technical challenge. How do you make a blade long enough to be useful without making it so fragile that it snaps when struck? And at the same time, how do you make it hard enough to hold a sharp edge? For an ancient smith, achieving all three, strength, hardness, and length, was incredibly difficult. So they began experimenting with two major approaches. The first was alloying. By mixing copper with elements such as arsenic and later tin, smiths could produce harder and more workable metals. This eventually opened the door to true bronze. But the second approach was even more interesting. Instead of solving the problem of making a long blade suitable for combat, some cultures simply avoided the problem altogether. They cast long, flat, beautifully decorated blades, often with silver inlays. These objects may not have been designed for battle. They were symbols, objects meant to display status, wealth, and power. And one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence comes from Arslan Tepe, where archaeologists discovered 9 swords in room A113. These swords were made from copper alloys containing roughly 3.2 to 5.8% arsenic, evidence that alloying was already being deliberately used to modify the properties of the metal. But according to researchers, these earliest swords were probably not ordinary battlefield weapons. Their value may have been less about how effectively they could kill, more about what they represented: power, status, authority. The sword was beginning its transformation, not yet into the ultimate battlefield weapon, but into something far more important, a symbol of power that would eventually become a weapon of war. In eastern Anatolia, beneath the collapsed walls of an ancient mud brick building, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. A bundle of weapons that had been tied together and hanging on a wall for more than 5,000 years. Inside building 111, they found 9 swords and 12 spearheads. Some of the weapons were even decorated with silver inlays. For their time, these swords were remarkably advanced. But that raises an even bigger question. If people had already created such sophisticated weapons, why were they simply left behind? Why were these swords hanging on a wall instead of being used? What were they really hiding? Was there something about these weapons that made them more valuable as symbols of power than as battlefield tools? The answer reveals something important about the earliest swords, and why creating a truly reliable fighting blade was much harder than it looked. What do you think? Tell me your answer in the comments. And if your answer is correct, I'll pin your comment. But then something even more surprising happened. The miracle metal that would eventually replace bronze was, at first, often worse than bronze. Early iron swords could be surprisingly weak. Some blades were soft enough to bend during combat, forcing warriors to stop and straighten them before they could continue fighting. So how did iron become a better sword material? The answer was a technique called quenching. Smiths heated carburized iron until it was red hot, then suddenly plunged it into water. That rapid cooling could dramatically increase the hardness of the steel near the surface. In some experimental and archaeological examples, hardness could rise from around 200 HV to more than 600 HV. One famous Solingen sword, examined by researchers, had a relatively soft core measuring around 215 HV, but its quenched surface reached approximately 620 HV. The difference was enormous. The smiths had discovered something important. They did not simply need to make the entire blade harder, they could make the surface extremely hard while keeping the core softer and tougher, and that changed what an iron sword could do. Today, when you look at a sword standing inside a museum, it seems like nothing more than an old piece of metal behind glass. No danger, no edge, just a relic. But once that same piece of metal could mean the difference between life and death. A blade didn't just change the way humans fought, it changed how far an attack could reach, how quickly it could happen, and ultimately, who would win. That single edge could decide whether a small city survived behind its walls, or whether an empire would erase its name from the map. For thousands of years, humans kept chasing the same question: how do we make metal sharper, stronger, better? And then, one day the world finally retired, the sword. New weapons arrived, new powers emerged, but the greatest thing that first Smith learned beside that fire never became obsolete, because the moment he placed a lifeless piece of metal into the flames and began hammering it, he wasn't just making a sword. He was discovering something far more important, that humans could take the raw materials of the world and shape them into whatever they imagined. From that day until today, that's exactly what we've been doing.